Hello? Um, Hello there. I'm live right now. This is my first live. I'm going to send a bunch of links to some people and then after I'm going to say hello and stuff. So, second. Sorry, I'll be very fast. One second, one more. I'm just going to send one more link and then I'll begin. And okay. There's a thing on the left, right part of my. Okay. Oh, someone's here. Hello. Um, Welcome to my first live reading. I'm going to be reading The Twits by Roald Dahl. Fantastic book, really funny. I think maybe I'll wait a little bit for someone else, some other people to come, or not. No, if I wait, I'll wait forever. I'll just begin reading right now. I'm reading from my phone, so sorry if it's a little bit bright onto my face, but yeah. Shall we begin? The Twits by Roald Dahl. Chapter 1. Hairy Faces. What a lot of hairy-faced men there are around nowadays. When a man grows hair all over his face, it is impossible to tell what he really looks like. Perhaps that's why he does it. He'd rather you didn't know. Then there's the problem of washing. When the very hairy ones wash their faces, it must be a big job, as a must. It must be as big a job as when you and I wash the hair on our heads. So what I want to know is this. How often do these hairy-faced men wash their faces? Is it only once a week like us, on Sunday nights? And do they shampoo it? Do they use hair dryer? Do they rub hair tonic on top of their faces from going to stop their facing from going bald? Do they go to a barber to have their hairy faces cut and trimmed? Or do they do it themselves in front of the bathroom mirror with nail scissors? I don't know, but the next time you see a man with a hairy face, which will probably be as soon as you step out on the street, maybe you will look at him more closely and start wondering about these things. Mr. Twit, Chapter 2. Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit was one of these very hairy-faced men. The whole lot of his face, except for his forehead, his eyes, and his nose, was covered with thick hair. The stuff even sprouted in revolting tufts out of his nostrils and ear holes. Mr. Twit felt that his hairiness made him look terrifically wise and grand, but in truth he was neither one of these things. Mr. Twit was a twit. He was born a twit, and now at the age of 60 he was a bigger twit than ever. The hair on Mr. Twit's face didn't grow smooth and matted as it does on most hairy-faced men. It grew in spikes that stuck out straight like the bristles of a nail brush. And how often did Mr. Twit wash his bristly, nail-brushy face of his? The answer is never. Not even on Sundays. He hadn't washed his he hadn't washed it in years. Chapter 3. Dirty Beards. As you know, an ordinary unhairy face like yours or mine simply gets a bit smudgy if it is not washed often enough, and there's nothing awful about that. But the hairy face is a very different matter. Things cling to hairs, especially food. Things like gravy go right in among the hairs and stay there. You and I can wipe our smooth faces with a fennel, and we quickly look more or less all right again. But the hairy faced man cannot do that. We can also, if we're very careful, eat our meals without spreading food all over our faces, but not so the hairy faced man. Watch carefully next time you see a hairy man eating his lunch, and you will notice that even if he opens his mouth very wide, it is impossible for him to get a spoonful of beef stew or ice cream and chocolate sauce into it without leaving some of it on the hairs. Mr. Twit didn't even bother to open his mouth wide when he ate. As a result, and because he never washed, there was always hundreds of bits of old breakfasts and lunches and suppers sticking to his hairs around his face. They weren't big bits, mind you, because he used to wipe those off with the back of his hand or on his sleeve while he was eating. But if you looked closely, not that you'd ever want to, you would see tiny little specks of dried up scrambled eggs stuck to the hairs and spinach, tomato ketchup, and fish fingers, minced chicken livers, and all the other disgusting things Mr. Tit liked to eat. If you looked closer still, hold your noses, ladies and gentlemen, if you peered deep into the mustachy bristles sticking out over his upper lip, you'd probably see much larger objects that had escaped the wipe of his hand. Things that had been there for months and months, like a piece of maggoty green cheese, or a moldy old cornflake, or even a slimy tail of a tinned sardine. Because of all this, Mr. Twit never really went hungry. By sticking out his tongue and curling it sideways to explore the hairy jungle around his mouth, he was always able to find a nasty morsel here and there to nibble on. What I'm trying to tell you is that Mr. Twit was a foul and smelly old man. He was also an extremely horrid old man, as you will find out in a moment. Chapter 4. Mrs. Twit. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity she didn't, because that because because that at any rate would because sorry, I'll start from the beginning. Mrs. Twit was no better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity she didn't, because that, at any rate, would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Take a look at her. Here's a, if you can see that, it's pretty ugly. Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face than that? I doubt it. But the funny thing is that Mrs. Twit wasn't born ugly. She had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown upon her year by year as she grew as she got older. Why would that happen? I'll tell you why. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on the face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts cannot ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose and a crooked mouth and a double chin and stick out teeth, but if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like sunbeams, and you will always look lovely. Nothing shone out of Mrs. Twit's face. In her right hand she carried a walking stick. That this was she used to tell people that this was because she had warts growing on the sole of her left foot. and walking was painful. But the real reason she carried the stick was so that she could hit things with it. Things like dogs and cats and small children. And then there was the glass eye. Mrs. Twit had a glass eye that was always looking the other way. Chapter 5. The Glass Eye. You can play a lot of tricks with a glass eye, because you can take it out and pop it back in again anytime you like. You can bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all the tricks. One morning she took out her glass eye and popped it into Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twit, oh, sorry, yeah, sorry, I'll just One morning she took out her glass eye and dropped it into Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twit sat there drinking the beer slowly. The froth made a white ring on the hairs around his mouth. He wiped the white froth onto his sleeve and wiped his sleeve onto his trousers. "You're plotting something," Mrs. Twit said, keeping her back turned so that he wouldn't see that she had taken out her glass eye. "Whenever you go all quiet like that, I know very well you're plotting something." Mrs. Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting away like mad. He was trying to think up a really nasty trick he could play on his wife that day. "You'd better be careful," Mrs. Twit said, "'cause when I see you starting to plot, I watch you like a wombat." "Oh, shut up, you old hag," Mr. Twit said. He went on drinking his beer, and his evil mind kept working away on the latest horrid trick he was going to play on the old woman. Suddenly, as Mr. Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat, he caught sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eye staring up at him from the bottom of the mug. It made him jump. "I told you I was watching you," cackled Mrs. Twit. "I've got eyes everywhere, so you'd better be careful." Chapter 6. The Frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and he carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom, getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets when he got between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for their fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then, all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed." "I bet it's that giant skillywiggler I saw on the floor just now," Mr. Twit said. "That what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. "It's got teeth like screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Save me! It's all over my feet." "It'll bite off your toes," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up under the sheets to go near the water. It started jumping on the pillow. Frogs love water, and this one was having a good time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. She screamed again. "By golly, it is a giant skillywiggler," Mr. Twit said. "It'll bite off your nose." Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow. Chapter 7. The Wormy Spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock she cooked spaghetti for lunch and she mixed the worms in the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. And the worms didn't show because everything was covered in with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti is moving!" cried Mr. Twit, poking around in it with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squishy." "I find it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, "Do you know what? Do you want to know why your spaghetti was so squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why it had a nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" he said. "Because it was worms!" cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor, rocking with a horrible laughter. Quite some characters we got here, am I right? Chapter 8. The Funny Walking Stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his workshed. There he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. The following night Mr. Twit stuck another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly so that the extra bits looked like a part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think of it, would you? It's happening so slowly you can't even notice it from 1 week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit, walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up her shoulder. That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "There's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. "It must have suddenly grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick," It's you, said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. It's you that's been getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now. That's not true, cried Mrs. Twit. You're shrinking, woman, said Mr. Twit. It's not possible. Oh, yes, it jolly well is. Said Mr. Twit. You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days. Never! She cried. Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks. Mrs. Twit began to feel feel so trembly she had to sit down. Let me just check. It's next chapters. Next, I'm going to. Um, Someone just sent me a picture saying that they couldn't enter the stream. So, um, is can every is um can anybody see this stream? I'm sorry. I'm just going to. I'll be right back. I'll be 1 second. I promise, and I'll be back with the book. Just 1 second. Sorry. Okay, I'm back. I'm just going to send this. I'm just going to give a message to a friend who wasn't able to enter this live stream. Okay, let's get back to it. Um, can anybody tell me how do I see where is the live chat or anything like that? Because I don't know how to, if someone gives a message or something like that, I don't know how to see how they're if I can't see any of the messages, you know? Um, I don't know how to see the live chat. Okay. Um, if anybody sends a message, I'll be. If you enter the live reading, please send a message onto the thing saying how you got into the live reading so that I know how people getting in. Thank you. That'd be great. Okay, let's get back to it. Chapter 9. Mrs. Twit has the shrinks. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair, and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, he had done the same to the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried. "And you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his fingers at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened, she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happened?" "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrinks into your feet, and in the end there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "I can't hear it," cried Mrs. Twit. "A terrible disease," said Mr. Twit. "The worst in the world." "The worst in the world." Sorry, that was Mr. Twit. Ah. "How long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up in a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I'd say no more than 10 or 11 days." "But isn't there anything I can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr. Twit. "Tell me!" she cried. "Oh, tell me quickly!" "We have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. "I'm ready! Just I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. "What must I do?" cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit. Chapter 10. Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outdoors, where he had everything planned for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a glass cylinder for filling the balloons. He had mixed an iron ring into the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing into the iron ring. He then tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled onto its string, trying to pop up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body, some tied around her neck, some under her arms, some to her wrists, and some even to her hair. Soon there were 50 colored balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching?" asked Mr. Twit. I can!" cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching like that." He put another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now, with her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled up towards the balloons. She was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. Chapter 11. Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. There's enough pull. There's enough pull here to take me to the moon, Mrs. Twit cried out. To take you to the moon, exclaimed Mr. Twit. What a ghastly thought! We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh dear me, no. We most certainly wouldn't, cried Mrs. Twit. Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe. Very well, my angel, said Mr. Twit, and with a glowlish grin on his lips, he knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds she was high up. She was so high up in this blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below looking up. What a pretty sight, he said to himself. How lovely, all those balloons. Look in the sky. And what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last the old hag is lost and gone forever. Chapter 12. Mrs. Twit comes ballooning down. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly, and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and start coming down." She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. Each time she bit through the strings and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and her rate of climb slowed down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. She stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly, she began to float downwards. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. Now she began to come absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinary old woman in the sky. Chapter 13. Hello, whoever is watching. Chapter 13. Mr. Twit gets a horrid shock. Mr. Twit, who thought he had seen his ugly wife for the last time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you drizzly old grunion! You rotten old turnip! You filthy old trumpet!" Mr. Twit jumped as though he had been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer, he looked up, he gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. He said. Ouch! Get you for this! Shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she had somehow managed to hang on to all the time. "I'll swish you to a swazzle!" she shouted. "I'll swash you to a swizzle! I'll knash you to a knuzzle! I'll knoosh you to a knazzle!" And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, slashing out with the stick, cracking him all over his body. Chapter 14. Just before, I would like to say if anybody is giving a message on the chat, if you're doing a message on the chat, I can't see it right now because I don't know where to look for the the message thing. So yeah. Anyways, okay, let's get back to it. Chapter 14. The house, the tree, and the monkey cage. But that's enough of that. We can go on forever watching these two disgusting people doing disgusting things to each other. We must get ahead with the story. Here is a picture of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house and garden. Some house. It looks like a prison. And not a window anywhere. Can you see that? Yeah, that's that's Mr. and Mrs. Twit's house. Who wants windows? Mr. Twit had said when they were building it. Who wants every Tom, Dick, and Harry peeping in to see what you're doing? It didn't occur to Mr. Twit that windows were meant mainly for looking out, not for looking into. And what do you think of that ghastly garden? There is a garden. Quite ghastly. And what do you think of that ghastly garden? Mrs. Twit was the gardener. She was very good at growing thistles and stinging nettles. "I always grow plenty of spiky thistles and plenty of stinging nettles," she used to say. "They keep out the nasty, nosy children." Near the house you can see Mr. Twit's work shed. The one side there is a big dead tree. To one side there's a big dead tree. It never has any leaves on it because it's dead. And not far from the tree you can see the monkey cage. There are 4 monkeys in it. They belong to Mr. Twit. You'll hear about them later. Chapter 15. Hoggety, stickety, hogget, hugty, hug, hugty, sticky glue. However you say that. Once a week, on Wednesdays, the Twits had bird pie for supper. Mr. Twit caught for the birds and Mrs. Twit cooked them. Mr. Twit was good at catching birds. On the day before bird pie, he would they, the, on the day before bird pie day, he would put the ladder against the big dead tree and climb into the branches with a bucket of glue and paintbrush. The glue he used was something called Hogtight. Ah, that's how you say. Okay. Hug tight, and it was stickier than any other glue in the world. He would paint it along the tops of all the branches and then go away. As the sun went down, the birds would fly in from all around the roost for the night, in the big dead tree. They didn't know, the poor things, that the branches were all smeared with horrible Hugtite. The moment they landed on a branch, their feet stuck, and that was that. The next morning, which was Bird Pie Day, Mr. Twit would climb up the ladder again and grab all the wretched, the wretched birds that were stuck to the tree. It didn't matter what kind they were, song thrushes, blackbirds, sparrows, crows, little Jenny wrens, robins, anything. They all went to the pot for Wednesday's bird pie supper. Here's that pie. I don't think I would want to eat it. Yeah. You can see all the legs sticking out of the birds. I'll just, I'll, I'm just going to check if anybody gave a message on the chat so I can just see if anybody, so that I can say hello. Sorry, I'll be fast. Tuck Lancaster. Hello. Okay. I hope you're enjoying the reading. Oh, it's hard to do that Mrs. Twit voice. Oh, it's echo. Okay. Oh, second person's inside. Hello. Lots of people for me. Find my first live stream, so welcome. Chapter 16. Four Sticky Little Boys. One, on one Tuesday evening, after Mr. Twit had been up the ladder and smeared the tree with Hugtite, four little boys crept into the garden to look at the monkeys. They didn't care about the thistles and the stinging nettles, not when there were monkeys to look at. After a while they got tired of looking at the monkeys, so they explored further into the garden and found the ladder leaning against a big dead tree. They decided to climb up. It's just for fun. They decided to climb up it for fun. There's nothing wrong with that. But the next morning, when Mr. Twit went out to collect the birds, he found four miserable little boys sitting in the tree, stuck as tight as they could possibly be by the seats of their pants to the branches. By the seats of their pants to the branches. I'm sorry, huh? There were no birds because the presence of the boys had scared them away. Mr. Twit was furious. As there are no birds, as there are no birds for my pie tonight, he shouted. Then it'll have to be boys instead. He started to climb the ladder. Boy pie might be better than bird pie, he went on, grinning horribly. More meat, and not so many tiny little bones. The boys were terrified. Terrified. He's going to boil us, cried one of them. He'll stew us alive, wailed the second one. He'll cook us with carrots, cried the third. But the fourth little boy, who had more sense than the others, whispered, Listen, I've just had an idea. We're only stuck by the seats of our pants. So quickly, unbutton your pants and slip out of them and fall to the ground. Mr. Twit had reached the top of the ladder and was just about to grab for the nearest boy, and when they all suddenly tumbled out of the tree and ran for home, with their naked bottoms winking at the sun. Um, my friend just said he can't enter the my link to this thing, so I'm just going to tell him that he should just go to the channel. So Um, Also, I'd just like to say, if you're watching, if it would be great, if you sent this to some other people who you think would be interested, because so that we can get more views, so better with the algorithm, so YouTube will recommend this to other people. So yeah, thanks. Also, I'd just like to say this book I'm reading is because it won on the poll, only by 2 votes, but it won. So, um, um, anyways, yes. Back to the book. Chapter 17. The Great Upside Down Monkey Circus. Now, for the monkeys. The 4 monkeys in the cage in the garden were all one family. They were Muggle Wump and his wife, and the 2 small children, Muggle Wump and the. Now, for the monkeys. The 4 monkeys in the cage were all one family. They were Muggle Wump and his wife, and their 2 small children. But what on earth were Mr. and Mrs. Twits doing with monkeys in their garden? Well, in the old days, they had both worked in a circus as monkey trainers. They used to teach monkeys to do tricks and dress up in human clothes and to smoke pipes and all the rest of that nonsense. Today, although they were retired, Mr. Twit wanted to train monkeys. It was his dream that one day he would own the first great upside-down monkey circus in the world. That meant that monkeys had to do everything upside down. They had to dance upside down on their hands with their feet in the air. They had to play football upside down. They had to bounce one on top of the other upside down, with Mugglewump at the bottom and the smallest baby monkey at the very top. They even had to eat and drink upside down, and that was not an easy thing to do because the food and water has to go up your throat instead of down it. In fact, it's almost impossible, but the monkeys simply had to do it, otherwise they got nothing. All this sounds pretty silly to you and me, and it sounded pretty silly to the monkeys too. They absolutely hated having to do this upside down nonsense day after day. It made them giddy, standing on their heads for hours on end. Sometimes 2 small monkey children would faint with so much blood going to their heads. But Mr. Twit didn't care about that. He kept them practicing for 6 hours every day, and if they didn't do as they were told, Mrs. Twit would soon come running with her beastly stick. Chapter 18. The roly-poly bird to the rescue. Mugglewump and his family longed to escape from the cage in Mr. Twit's garden and go back to the African jungle where they came from. They hated Mr. and Mrs. Twit for making their lives so miserable. They also hated them for what they did to the birds every day, every Tuesday and Wednesday. "Fly away, birds!" they used to shout, jumping about in the cage, waving their hands. "Don't sit on that big dead tree. It's just smeared all over with sticky glue. Go and sit somewhere else." But these were English birds, and they wouldn't understand the weird African language the monkeys spoke. So they took no notice, and went on, using the big dead tree and getting caught for Mrs. Twit's bird pie. Then one day a truly magnificent bird flew down out of the sky and landed on the monkey cage. "Good heavens!" cried all the monkeys together. "It's the roly-poly bird! What on earth are you doing over here in England, roly-poly bird?" Like the monkeys, the roly-poly bird came from Africa, and he spoke the very language as they did. "I've come on holiday," said the roly-poly bird. "I like to travel." He fluffed his marvelous colored feathers and looked down rather grandly at the monkeys. "For most people," he went on, "flying away on the holiday is very expensive, but I can fly anywhere in the world for nothing." "Do you know how to talk to these English birds?" Mugglewump asked him. "Of course I do," said the roly-poly bird. "It's not good going to a country and not knowing the language." Then we must hurry, said Mugglewump. Today is Tuesday, and over there you can already see the revolting Mr. Twit up on the ladder, painting sticky glue on all the branches of the big dead tree. This evening, when the birds come in to roost, you must warn them not to perch on the tree, or they will be made into bird pie. That evening, the roly-poly bird flew round and round the big dead tree, singing out, "There's there's sticky stick stuff all over the tree. If you land in the branches, you'll never get free. So fly away, stay up high, or you'll finish up tomorrow in a hot bird pie." Oh, my friend is watching. Hello, Zell. Chapter 19. No bird pie for Mr. Twit. The next morning, when Mr. Twit came out of with his huge basket to snatch all the birds from the. You can also send the hello on the chat, Zell, so you don't have to go to the to your all the way to the to the WhatsApp to give me the message. So yeah, if that's easier for you, I can see it. Ah yes, Doc Lancaster. Really enjoy listening to your characters. Yeah, it's hard on my voice sometimes doing those voices, but yeah, especially Mrs. Twit. Okay, just liked my own video just to. Okay, anyways. Okay, yes, I'll go back to reading. Okay, chapter 19. No bird pie for Mr. Twit. The next morning, when Mr. Twit came out of his huge basket to snatch all the birds from the big dead tree, there wasn't a single one on it. They were all sitting on top of the monkey cage. The roly-poly bird was there as well, and Mugglewump and his family were inside the cage, and the whole lot of them were laughing at Mr. Twit. Chapter 20. That was a short chapter. My God. Chapter 20. Still no bird pie for Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit wasn't going to wait another week for his bird pie supper. He loved bird pie. It was his favorite meal. So that same day he went after the birds again. This time he smeared all the top jar bars of the monkey cage with sticky glue, as well as the branches of the big dead tree. "Now I'll get you," he said. "Whichever one of you sit on it." The monkeys crouched inside the cage watching all this, and later on the roly-poly bird came swooping in for an evening chat. They shouted out, "Don't land on our cage, roly-poly bird! It's covered in sticky glue. So is the tree." And that evening, as the sun went down and all the birds came in again to roost, the roly-poly bird flew around and round the monkey cage and the big dead tree, swinging out his warning. "There's sticky stuff now on the cage and the tree. If you want to land on either, you'll never get free. So fly away, stay up high, or you'll finish up tomorrow in a hot bird pie." Chapter 20. Oh, three people watching. Hello, everybody. Chapter 21. Mr. and Mrs. Twit go off to buy guns. The next morning, Mr. Twit came out with his huge basket. Not a single bird was setting on either the monkey cage or the big dead tree. They were all perched happily on the roof of Mr. Twit's house. The roly-poly bird was up was up there as well, and the monkeys were in the cage, and the whole lot of them were hooting and laughing at Mr. Twit. I'll wipe that silly laugh off your beaks, Mr. Twit screamed at the birds. I'll get you next time, you filthy feathery frumps. I'll wring your necks, the whole lot of you, and have you bubbling in the spot for bird pie before this day is out. How are you going to do that? Asked Miss. How are you going to do that? Asked Mrs. Twit, who had come outside to see what all the noise was about. I won't have you smearing sticky glue all over the roof of our house. Mr. Twit got excited. I've got a great idea, he cried. He didn't bother to keep his voice down because he didn't think that the monkeys could understand. We'll both go into town right away and we'll buy a gun each, he shouted. How's that? Brilliant! Cried Mrs. Twit, grinning and showing her long yellow teeth. We'll buy those big shotguns and spray out 50 bullets, more with each bang. 50 bullets, or more with each bang. Exactly, said Mr. Twit. Lock up the house while I go and make sure the monkeys are safely shut away. Mr. Twit went over to the monkey cage. Attention! He barked in the fearsome monkey trainer's voice. Upside down, all of you, and jump to it, one on top of the other. Quick! Get on with it, or you'll feel Mrs. Twit stick across your backsides. Obediently, the poor monkeys stood on their hands and clambered one on top of the other, with Mugglewump at the bottom and the smallest child at the very top. Now stay there till we come back, Mr. Twit ordered. Don't you dare move, and don't overbalance. When we return in 2 or 3 hours' time, I shall expect to find you all in the exact same position as you are now. You understand? With that, Mr. Twit marched away with Mrs. Twit. Mrs. Twit went with him, and the monkeys were left alone with the birds. Sorry, I'm just um okay, back to it. Chapter 22. Mugglewump has an idea. As soon as Mr. and Mrs. Twit had disappeared down the road, the monkeys all flipped back onto their feet, the right way up. Quick, get the key. Qu- Quick, get the key, Mugglewump called out to the roly-poly bird, who was still sitting on the roof of the house. What key? Shouted the roly-poly bird. The key to the door of our cage, cried Mugglewump. It's hanging on the nail in the work shed. That's where he always puts it. The roly-poly bird flew down and came back with the key in his beak. Mugglewump reached a hand through the bars of the cage and took the key. He put it in the lock and turned it. The lock opened. All four monkeys leapt out together. We are free! Cried the two little ones. Where shall we go, Dad? Where shall we hide? Don't get excited, said Mugglewump. Calm down, everybody. Before we escape from this beastly place, we have one very important thing to do. What? They asked him. We're going to turn those terrible twits upside down. We're going to what? They cried. You must be joking, Dad. I'm not joking, Mugglewump said. We're going to turn both Mr. and Mrs. Twit upside down with their legs in the air. Don't be ridiculous, the roly-poly bird said. How can we possibly turn those two maggoty old monsters upside down? We can, cried Mugglewump. We're going to make them stand on their heads for hours and hours, perhaps forever, and let them see what it feels like for a change. How? Said the roly-poly bird. Just tell me how. Mugglewump laid his head on one side and a tiny twinkling little smile touched the corners of his mouth. Now and again, he said, but not very often, I have a brilliant idea. This is one of them. Follow me, my friends, follow me. He scampered off towards the house, and the three other monkeys and the roly-poly bird went after him. Buckets and paintbrushes, cried Mugglewump. That's what we want next. There are plenty in the workshed. Hurry up, everyone. Get a bucket and a paintbrush. Inside Mr. Twit's workshed, there was an enormous barrel of hug-tight sticky glue, the stuff he used for catching birds. Fill your buckets, Mugglewump ordered. We're now going into the big house. Mrs. Twit had hidden the key to the front door under the mat. Oh, Zori's also gonna watch? Okay. Hello, Zori, when you're watching? Okay. Yes, the more people, the better. Well, I just lost 2 viewers for a second there. Okay. Anyway, let me go check the chat. Nothing happening in the chat. She is watching though. Oh, I only see one viewer, but okay. Oh, on your thing, watching on your thing. Oh, okay. Well, hello there, Zori and Zell. If anybody is wondering, I'm seeing these messages from WhatsApp. This is not from the live chat or anything like that. So, okay. Anyways, buckets and paintbrushes. Oh, on her phone. Oh, okay. I still see only one view. Okay, it's okay. I'm just going to keep reading, and I'm going to go back from where I was before. Um, yeah. Hope you're enjoying. Everybody who's watching. Buckets and paintbrushes, cried Mugglewump. That's what we want. There are plenty in the workshed. Hurry up, everyone. Get a bucket, and a paintbrush. Inside Mrs. Twit's workshed, there was an enormous barrel of Hugtite sticky glue, the stuff he used to catching birds. Fill your buckets, Mugglewump ordered. We are now going into the big house. Mrs. Twit had hidden the key to the front door under the mat, and Mugglewump had seen her doing it, so it was easy for them to get in. In they went, all four monkeys, with their buckets of sticky glue. Then came the roly-poly bird, flying in after them, with a bucket in his beak and a brush in his claw. Chapter 23. Oh, 3 viewers now. Hello, everybody. Hope you're enjoying. This is chapter 23. 23. Twits by Roald Dhal. Chapter 23. The Great Glue Painting Begins. This is the living room, announced Mugglewump. The grand and glorious living room, where those fearful, frumptuous freaks eat bird pie every week for supper. Please don't mention bird pie again, said the roly-poly bird. It gives me the shudders. We mustn't waste time, cried Mugglewump. Hurry up, hurry up. Now the first thing is this. I want everyone to paint sticky glue all over the ceiling. Cover it all. Smear it in every corner. Over the ceiling, they cried. Why the ceiling? Never mind why, shouted Mugglewump. Just do as you're told and don't argue. But how do we get up there? They cried. We can't reach. Monkeys can reach anywhere, shouted Mugglewump. He was in a frenzy of excitement now, waving his paintbrush and his bucket and leaping about all over the room. Come on, jump on the table, stand on the chairs, hop on each other's shoulders. Roly-poly can do it flying. Don't stand there gaping. We have to hurry. Don't you understand that? Those terrible twits will be back any moment, and this time they'll have guns. Get on with it, for heaven's sake, get on with it. And so the great glue painting of the ceiling began. All the other birds who had been sitting on the roof flew in to help, carrying paintbrushes in their claws and beaks. There were buzzards, magpies, rooks, ravens, and many more. Everyone was splashing away like mad, and with so many helpers, the job was soon finished. Chapter 24. The carpet goes on the ceiling. What now? They all said, looking at Mugglewump. Aha! cried Mugglewump. Now for the fun. Now for the greatest upside down trick of all time. Are you ready? We're ready, said the monkeys. We're ready, said the birds. Pull out the carpet, shouted Mugglewump. Pull this huge carpet out from under the furniture and stick it onto the ceiling. Onto the ceiling! Cried one of the small monkeys. But that's impossible, Dad. I'll stick you onto the ceiling if you don't shut up, snapped Mugglewump. He's Dotty, they cried. He's balmy. He's batty. He's nutty. He's screwy. He's wacky, cried the roly-poly bird. Poor old Muggles has gone off his wump at last. Oh, do stop shouting that such rubbish and give me a hand, said Mugglewump, catching hold of one corner of the carpet. Pull, you nitwits, pull! The carpet was enormous. It covered the entire floor from the wall to the wall. It had a red gold pattern on it. It was not easy to pull an enormous carpet off the floor when the room is full of tables and chairs. Pull! Yelled Mugglewump. Pull, pull, pull! He was like a demon hopping around the room and telling everyone what to do. But you couldn't blame him. After months and months of standing on his head with his family, he couldn't wait for the time when the terrible Twits would be doing the same thing. At last that's what he hoped. With the monkey and the birds all pulling and puffing, the carpet was dragged off the floor and finally hoisted up onto the ceiling. And there it stuck. All at once, the whole ceiling of the living room was carpeted in red and gold. I'm going to check the live chat, see how it's going. In there. Okay. Again, I'm just going to say if whoever is watching right now, if Zell you're still watching or if anybody else is watching, um, if you can send this to anybody you think is interested in this, it would be great because it really helps. Anyway, we're soon getting to the end of the book, but if you really want it, I don't know who's watching, but if you want it, I can. I was thinking maybe I could read another book, a poem book. It's really funny. I think it would be maybe great funny if we did two books in one. But you let me know what you think, and then yeah, once I finish the book, you let me know what you think, and then yeah. Okay, chapter 25. The furniture goes up. Now the table, the big table, shouted Mugglewump. Turn the table upside down, and put a dollop of sticky glue on the bottom of each leg. Then we shall stick that onto the ceiling as well. Hoisting the huge table upside down onto the ceiling was not an easy job, but they managed it in the end. Will it stay there? They cried. Is the glue strong enough to hold it up? It's the strongest glue in the world, Mugglewump replied. It's the special bird killing glue smeared on trees. Please, said the roly-poly bird, I have asked you before not to mention that subject. How would you like it if it was monkey pie they made every Wednesday and all your friends had been boiled up and I went on talking about it? Yes, it is a good book, though. I agree with you. Oh, 4 people watching. Hello. I do beg your pardon, said Mugglewump. I'm so excited. I hardly know what I'm saying. Now the chairs. Do the same with the chairs. All the chairs must be stuck upside down to the ceiling, and in their right places. Oh, do hurry up, everyone. Any moment now, those filthy freaks are going to come rushing in with their guns. The monkeys with the birds helping them put the glue on the bottom of each chair leg and hoisted them up to the ceiling. Now smaller tables. Now the smaller tables, shouted Mugglewump, and the big sofa, and the sideboard, and the lamps, and all the tiny little things, the ashtrays, the ornaments, and all the beastly plastic gnome of the sideboard. Everything, absolutely everything, must be stuck to the ceiling. It was terrible hard work. It was especially difficult to stick everything onto the ceiling exactly in exactly its right place. But they got it done in the end. What now? Asked the roly-poly bird. He was out of breath and so tired he could hardly flap his wings. Now the pictures, cried Mugglewump. Turn all the pictures upside down, and will one of you birds please fly out onto the road and watch to see those when those frumptious freaks are coming back. I'll go, said the roly-poly bird. I'll sit on the telephone wires and keep guard. It'll give me a rest. Chapter 23, 26. The ravens swoop over. They had only finished the job when the roly-poly bird came swooping in, screaming, "They're coming back! They're coming back!" Quickly the birds flew back onto the roof of the house. The monkeys rushed into their cage and stood upside down, one on top of the other. At a moment later, Mr. Twit and Mrs. Twit came marching into the garden, carrying a very fearsome-looking gun. "I'm glad to see those monkeys are still upside down," said Mr. Twit. "They're too stupid to do anything else," said Mrs. Twit. "Hey, look at all those cheeky birds still on the roof. Let's go inside and load our lovely new guns, and it'll be bang, bang, bang! Bird pie for supper!" Just as Mr. and Mrs. Twit were about to enter the house, two black ravens swooped low over their heads. Each bird carried a paintbrush in its claw, and each paintbrush was smeared with sticky glue. As the ravens whizzed over, they brushed a streak of sticky glue on the tops of Mr. and Mrs. Twit's head. They did it with the lightest touch, but even so, the Twits both felt it. "What was that? What was that?" cried Mrs. Twit. "Some beastly bird has dropped his dirty droppings on my head." "On mine too," shouted Mr. Twit. "I felt it! I felt it!" "Don't touch it!" cried Mrs. Twit. "You'll get it all over your hands. Come inside and we'll wash it off at the sink." "The filthy, dirty brutes!" yelled Mr. Twit. "I bet they did it on purpose. Just wait till I've loaded up my gun." Mrs. Twit got the key from under the doormat, where Mugglewump had carefully replaced it, and into the house they went. Chapter 27. The Twits are turned upside down. "What's this?" gasped Mr. Twit as they entered the living room. "What's happened?" screamed Mrs. Twit. Tell me if you can see this. all the furniture upside down. If you're wondering why I'm reading from a phone, it's because I don't have the book, this book, so I'm reading it from the phone. But yeah. They stood in the middle of the room, looking up. All the furniture, the big table, the chairs, the sofa, the lamps, the little side tables, the cabinet, the bottles of beer in it, the ornaments, the electric fire, the carpet, everything was stuck upside down to the ceiling. The pictures were upside down to the walls, and the floor they were standing on was absolutely bare. What's more, it had been painted white to look like the ceiling. "Look!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "The floor! What's the floor's up there? This is the ceiling. We are standing on the ceiling." "We're upside down!" gasped Mr. Twit. "We must be upside down. We're standing on the ceiling, looking down at the floor." "Oh, help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Help, help, help! I'm beginning to feel giddy." "So am I! So am I!" cried Mr. Twit. "I don't like this one bit." We're upside down, and all the blood's going to my head! Screamed Mrs. Twit. Something quickly! I shall die! I know I will! I've got it! Cried Mrs. Twit. I know what we'll do. We'll stand on our heads, then anyway we'll be right way up. So they stood on their heads, and of course, the moment their tops of their heads touched the floor, the sticky glue that the ravens had brushed on a few seconds before did before did its job. They were stuck. They were pinned down, cemented, glued, fixed to the two floorboards. Through a crack in the middle door, the monkeys watched. They jumped right out of their cage the moment the Twits had gone inside. And the roly-poly bird watched, and all the other birds flew in and out to catch a glimpse of this extraordinary sight. Chapter 28. The Monkey's Escape. That evening Mugglewump and his family went up to the big wood on top of the hill, and in the smallest tree of all they built a marvelous tree house. All the birds, especially the big ones, and the crows, and the rooks, and the magpies, made their nests around the tree house so that nobody could see it from the ground. You can't stay up here forever, you know, the roly-poly bird said. Why not? Asked Muggle-Wump. It's a lovely place. Just you wait till winter comes, said the roly-poly bird said. Monkeys don't like cold weather, do they? Most certainly we don't, cried Muggle-Wump. Are the winters so very cold over here? It's all snow and ice, said the roly-poly bird. Sometimes it's so cold, a bird will wake up in the morning with its feet frozen to the bough that he's been roosting on. Then what shall we do? Cried Mugglewump. My family will all be deep freezed. No, they won't, said the roly-poly bird, because when the first leaves start falling from the trees in the autumn, you can fly home to Africa with me. Don't be ridiculous, Mugglewump said. Monkeys can't fly. You can sit on my back, said the roly-poly bird. I shall take you one at a time. You will travel by the roly-poly superjet, and it won't cost you a penny. I think this is the last chapter, so or is it one more after this? Anyway, it's one of these. So, chapter 29. Twits get the strings. And down here in the horrid house, Mr. and Mrs. Twits were still stuck upside down to the floor of the living room. It's all your fault, yelled Mr. Twit, thrashing his legs in the air. You're the one, you ugly old cow, who went on hopping around shouting, we're upside down, we're upside down. And you're the one who said to stand on our heads so that we'd be the right way up, you risky old warthog, screamed Mrs. Twit. Now we'll never get free. We're stuck here forever. You may be stuck here forever, said Mr. Twit, but not me. I'm going to get away. Mr. Twit wriggled and squirmed, he squiggled and wormed, he twisted and turned, he struggled and churned, but the sticky glue held him to the floor just as tightly as it had once held the poor birds to the dead tree. He was still upside down, as ever, standing on his head. But heads are not made to be stood upon. If you stand on your head for a very long time, a horrid thing happens, and this is where Mr. Twit got his biggest shock of all. With so much weight on it from above, his head began to be squashed into his body. Quite soon it had disappeared completely, sunk out of sight. The fatty folds of his flabby cheek sight sunk out of sight in the fatty folds of his flabby cheek. I'm shrinking, bubbled Mr. Twit. So am I, cried Mrs. Twit. Help me! Save me! Call a doctor! Yelled Mr. Twit. I'm getting the dreaded shrinks. And so he was. Mrs. Twit was getting the dreaded shrinks too. And this time it wasn't fake. It was the real thing. Their heads shrank into their necks, and their necks began shrinking into their bodies, and their bodies began shrinking into their legs, and their legs began shrinking into their feet. And 1 week later, on a nice sunny afternoon, a man called Fred came around to read the gas meter. When nobody answered the door, Fred peeped into the house, and there he was, on the floor of the living room, two bundles. Oh, no problem, Zori. I got the message from a friend. No problem, Zori. Um, if you're tired, go sleep or something, rest. No problem. Um, I'm glad you listened to me reading for all this time. Greatly appreciate it. Uh, when nobody answered the door, Fred peeped into the house, and there he saw on the floor of the living room two bundles of old clothes, two pairs of shoes, and a walking stick. There was nothing much more left in this world of Mr. and Mrs. Twits, and everyone, including Fred, shouted, "Hooray!" The end. Anyways, I think I'm still I still have a bunch of energy. If everybody else is tired here, then I don't mind finishing the stream. But I was thinking maybe let me check the live chat if anything happened. Maybe nothing. Maybe I was thinking of reading another book of poems. It's not that long, but it's a funny book. I think it would give a good laugh, and then after I think I'll be finished and go to sleep. But yeah, please say in the chat if you would stay for the reading of another small poem book. It's really funny. Just saying, it's unless if you don't, then okay, I'll just finish it now, and then maybe tomorrow I'll come back and read. But yeah, how is everybody thinking on that? Could you say in the chat, please? Read the poem book, Zal says. Sure, okay. If you're going to stay for it, sure. Oh, 4 viewers. Hello, whoever entered in. I just finished this book and okay, Yazel, okay, okay, Zel, I'll ask you next time. Well, whoever just entered, I'm going to read another book after this. It's a poem book, a short, not very long, but yeah, I'm going to go get it. I'll be right back in a minute. Please stay. I'll be right back. Hello there. Oh, two people left the stream. Okay. um, I just realized I have it right here. I have them right here. So, which one should I read? This one is like, um, for in my opinion, this one is funnier, bit longer, but funnier, shorter, more kiddish and stuff. But yeah, I think this one I think would be more entertaining at this time at night. So I think I'll read this one. Let me know what you think. Tuck Lancaster, keep reading if your voice can make it. Yeah, my voice can make it. Yeah. I feel a little bit sore, but it's not much. In this book, I'm not going to be making any strong voices like hello. But yeah. Okay, so um okay. Okay, I'll read this one. A Book of Milliganimals. Very funny in my opinion. Um yeah. Okay. I'm not going to. There is a final part where there is a story in the final part. I'm not going to read that because it's a little bit boring, that part. But yeah, I mean it's not boring, but for this time at night when people are tired, yeah, I think it's boring a bit. So I'm going to read all the poems and stuff like that, which is the main part of the book. So yeah, let's begin. Also, I'm going to quote what every single YouTuber says because yes, smash that like button. Okay, let's begin. Begin. Part 1. Animals. I've actually already read this book on the channel, but why not do it again live? Right? Where does it start? The cheetah. A sleek cat is the cheetah. No one other could look neat. He's heavily dotted, so he's easily spotted, and he lives. I did smash that like Great Zell, good job. Keep it going. Again, I'll start again from the cheetah. A sleek cat is the cheetah. No other could be neater. He's heavily dotted, so he's easily spotted, and he lives in Tanganyika. Sorry if I can't pronounce a ton of these things because the writer went crazy on this. Pygmy elephant. The pygmy elephant is made much shorter than the giant brigade. He lives much closer to the ground, and that is where he's usually found. Why should an elephant be so wee? My friend, it's not good asking me. Alligator. From Sydney Zoo, an alligator was put on a board, a flying fighter. He ate the pilot and the navigator, then asked for more with mashed potato. It just makes no sense. Tiger, tiger, burning, etc. Tiger travel stealthily, using first legs 1 and 3. They alternate with 2 and 4, and after that there are no more. Envoy, tiger, tiger, burning bright, look out, you'll set the jungle alight. Ant, an elephant ant, an elephant. Said the tiny ant to the elephant, mind how you tread in this clearing. But alas, cruel fate! She was crushed by the weight of an elephant hard of hearing. Silly old baboon. There was a baboon who one afternoon said, I think I will fly to the sun. So with two great palms strapped to his arms, he started his takeoff run. Mile after mile he galloped in style, but never once fell left to the ground. left the ground. "You're running too slow," said the passing crow. "Try reaching the speed of sound." So he put on a spurt. By God, how it hurt! The soles of his feet caught fire. There were great clouds of steam as he raced through a stream, but he still didn't get any higher. Racing on through the night, both his knees caught alight, and smoke billowed out from his rear. Quick to his aid came a fire brigade, who chased him for over a year. Many moons passed by. Did the baboon ever fly? Did he ever get to the sun? I've just heard today that he's well on his way. He'll be passing through Acton at 1. Giraffe number 1. We come now to the stately giraffe, who's never been known to smile or laugh, but once long ago he laughed at a Tory who told him, they say, a very tall story. Let me try read this thing over here. There was a Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scottishman. And the Jew said to the chicken, "Why did you cross the road?" What? Let me repeat that so you understand how nonsensical this makes. There was an Englishman, and an Irishman, and a Scottishman. And the Jew said to the chicken, "Why did you cross the road?" Okay, okay. My kind of jokes. That's my kind of jokes. Giraffe number 2. This self-made giraffe was mentioned in dispatches for making himself sawdust string and patches. Good for him. What? Yes, Sal, I know. Well, let me read that again. It just makes absolutely no sense. There was an Englishman, an Irishman, and a Scottishman. And the Jew said to the chicken, "Why did you cross the road?" Okay, we did already giraffe number 2. Wasn't fun. The lion is fierce, his teeth can pierce the skin of a postman's knee. It serves him right that because of his bite he gets no letters, you see. Oh, because the postman. The pig. A very rash young lady pig. They say she was a smasher. Suddenly ran under a van, now she's gammon's rasher. No one knows what that means. Only the writer. Milliganimals. Part 2, Milliganimals. Okay, I think here is where it begins to get crazy in the words and stuff. A tourist who went to Tunisia said, "Are we allowed to go fishing here?" "Oh no," said the bay, "all the fish gone away. I've only got chips on my dish here." No fish with the chips. A baby sardine saw her first submarine. She was scared and watched through a peephole. "Oh, come on, come on, come on. Oh, come, come, come," said the sardine's mom. "It's only a tin full of people." And that's what sardines eat. The Admiral Beard. I don't know how to say this. I'm guessing it's bird, but it's with a Y. You must have heard of Admiral Beard, Beard, I think, who found a pole called South. He flew all the way from USA, a lordy hush my mouth, because he found the South Pole. One can, two cans. That was random. The flea. How teeny weeny is the little teeny flea. One would think that one so small could do no harm at all. But all last night in my hotel he made me scratch like merry hell. Words said, "Bungalilooly," said the monkey to the flea. It wasn't much to say, but it wasn't much to say, but it passed the time away. Yes. Whatever you're thinking, yes. The Gofongo, whatever that is. The Gofongo, if you please, is a fish with singing knees and a tail that plays the Spanish clarinet. He has toes that whistle tunes and explode like toys balloons, hence his many, many visits to the vet. The Gafongo, when he likes, swallows jam and rusty bikes, orange pips, and treacle pudding boiled in glue. He loves chips with rusty nails and can swallow iron nails, that is why they cannot keep one in the zoo. But Gafongo as a pet would cause panic and regret. People tried it and were nearly driven balmy. For once inside a house, he screams, "I'm a Jewish mouse!" Then he runs away and joins the Arab army. You're right. What the Wiggle Woggle said. That makes sense. The Wiggle Woggle said, "I wish that I were dead. I've pain in my tummy and it's traveling up the bed. I wish that I were something that never got pain and a little bit fluffy stuff that vanished down the drain. I could be a tiger's whisker, a tuba made of bread, the purple eye of a custard pie, with a trouser made of lead. There must be other things of tiny leather bread, or a bit of crumpled paper where the watermelons feed. A yellow thing with lumps on, a yellow thing without, some hairy stuff on a powder puff, the snuffs candles out, which I wish I were a lamp post." And then this appears. Yes to Milliganimals. Oh, you know Milliganimals? Yeah, it's funny. I haven't read in a while though, but it's funny. Come back to it for a while because I would laugh for it so much when I was smaller. So it's so funny. Lampposts don't get pain. A leaky, rusty gutter flooding other people's drains. All those are what I'd like to be, the Wiggle Woggle said. But he stayed a Wiggle Woggle, and what's more, he played in bed. He stayed in bed. Yes, I agree. I agree with that. The Wiggle Woggle's a bit crazy. Mhm. Okay, yeah, this is where the story thing starts. So yeah, that's the end of the poems, but there's just one poem from this other one I would like to read because it's really funny. I just would like to read this one, mostly just because of the name of the poem, but yeah, it's just it just okay. Hippo rhino strikeout. Such a beast is the hippo rhino strikeout. How it got so mixed up, we'll never know how. It sleeps all day and whistles all night, and it wears yellow socks, which are far too tight. If you laugh at the hippoporino strikeout, you're bound to get an awful row. The creature is protected, you see, from silly people like you and me. Yeah, that's it from that one. Um, I just one second. I'll be back 1 second. Just um, give me 1 second. I'll be right back. Hello. Oh, right when I came back, the view went away. Someone was watching. Um. Anyway, I can't read more. It's getting late, and I need to go to sleep. So I think I'll be back tomorrow to read um more of the more some book. I don't know what. Um these poem books are more of a backup book, but they're not the main book to read, kind of. They're like for a funny mood, and then after just as finishing I wanted to read it because it's just a bit funny and I wanted to put that. But yeah, I don't know what I'll read next for next reading. I'll find something. Maybe something from Roald Dahl also, probably. He's my favorite author. And yeah, I'm going to now just make a short recording. I'll read two chapters from The Enchanted Wood by Enid Blyton because that's the main big book I'm reading on the channel. It's not going to be live, but yeah, I'm going to be reading two chapters from that to for part seven. We're getting kind of close to finishing that book, so if you're interested in The Enchanted Wood by Enid Blyton, go check my first video out where I read the first two chapters of the book. Yeah. Anyways, good night to everybody who is watching. Sorry. Good night to everybody who's watching. Hope you enjoyed the readings. Um, and yeah, um I'll be back tomorrow. Also, check out I have a second channel also. It's called Jotty the Great. I put comedy stuff over there. I think it's pretty funny. Um, if you're interested in comedy stuff, go check that out. I have a few videos uploaded. More, yeah. Anyway, okay. Thanks for tuning in. You've taken time from your night to be here, and I really appreciate that. So yeah. Um, good night.